So tonight, we're very excited to have Venerable Pandit Bhikkhu back to continue his talk on the exploration of dependent originations. So I believe many of us it's fascinated by his talk last month. If you missed the talk, the video is available on the website. So this time, Bhante will elaborate on this topic on agency, how action shapes perception in the arising of experience. So if any of you who haven't known Venerable Pandit, he's a British Buddhist monk who has been ordained in the Theravada Buddhist tradition for over 25 years. He chose Thailand as his place of ordination in 96 after studying Buddhism and non-dual spirituality in various parts of the world for a number of years. And he's the founder and principal teacher of the Little Bangkok Sangha, which for a long time was the only Sangha offering Dharma in English in Bangkok. He has a degree in psychology and MA in Buddhist studies. Various media of his talks are available online. So Bhante is very good in producing video. So he's also a psychologist and a university lecturer. And Bhante has a reputation for being a very engaging speaker who effortlessly makes links between the Buddha's wisdom teaching and contemporary understanding of consciousness. So Bhante has specific interest in psychology and often incorporate fairy tales in his Dharma talks. Some of his video can be found in YouTube at littlebang.org. I can put it on the chat as well. So please put our palms together to welcome Venerable Pandit Bhikkhu. Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you for the introduction. Just wanted to check the screen sharing. Can you see the fan?
Yes.
Okay, that's how hot it is in Thailand. Okay, so you can all see the fan, right? Okay, yeah, I really like that. Saw that this morning on my way to lunch. That's how you know it's the hot season. Okay.
So is it melting or what?
I don't know. No idea. Still trying to get to grips with Zoom. I'm not a native Zoomer. I seem to have lost the controls for Zoom. Oh, there we go. It's at the top. Okay, I've got it. So I have to stop screen sharing, don't I? Am I still sharing the screen or not? You are. Stop share. Okay, I've got it. Okay, figured it out. Okay, so hi everybody, and check the chats there. Okay. So if we are all ready, I can get started. I've been feel free at any time if you want to interrupt or ask questions or put your cat in front of the camera. I like cats. No, I'd rather see the cat than anything else. We actually had 3 kittens in my building, and somebody was looking after them, and I found myself going out of my room like 5 times a day, bits of tuna fish and things to share to these 3 kittens. But they just disappeared last week. I don't know, maybe they were sold or given away. Okay, so we are continuing with the discussion of something that I myself have been working on, and it's the nature and the basis of my own practice. That for many, many years, I've been studying Dharma and practicing. And I have a disconnect between what the Buddha was actually teaching, what he was saying, what Buddhist teachers are saying, and what I was experiencing in my own meditation. And a lot of the teachers I find, especially Western teachers, seem to be teaching a lot of self-help stuff. And how can I deal with my anger, and how can I deal with my children, things like this. And that's all fine. This is the Dharma that I kind of grew up with that helped me so much. But when I compare it to what the Buddha was actually saying in the suttas, that was really something completely different. There, the Buddha was talking about a radical transformation of experience, of going beyond life and death, going beyond rebirth, a condition wherein there is no desire. And that's unimaginable to me. This isn't feeling calm or using meditation to let go of stress and things like that. This is something really radical. He was talking about using the meditation to experience past lives. He was using the meditation to experience heavens and hells and devas and ghosts and things like this. And so I've always had this kind of disconnect between what has been taught by many people, by many Buddhist teachers, and what the Buddha himself was actually teaching. And then we have my own experience, which tends to be just a chaotic jumble of barely awake semi-consciousness, which pretty much describes my meditation. A lot of people are really good meditators. I've met many of them. And they can attain to these really high states of psychic powers and things very quickly. And other meditators are the grinders, the soldiers, or the Indians, not the chiefs, the workers. And that describes myself. I've been always willing to sit and do my meditation, whether I like it or not. And for many, many years, the answer to that, in fact, was not. It wasn't something that I particularly enjoyed. It was something that gladdened rather than enjoyed. Do you see the difference? Gladdening means that you've done the right thing. You feel that you've moved in the right direction. But enjoyment is something else. So if you compare it to food, gladdening would be a nice light salad with a simple vinaigrette, no oil, no sugar, no salt. And that's the right thing to do. You know that's the right thing to do. But to enjoy something, well, that's a pizza. So there's a difference between gladdening and enjoying. So I was always gladdened by my meditation. I feel that I'm doing the right thing. I'm moving in the right direction. But I wouldn't particularly enjoy it or look forward to it. And so it took a long time for me to really bring my meditation up to standard. And again, I feel that I was perhaps a little misled by some of the teachers that are out there. I don't want to name names because they're people who have helped me tremendously and whose teaching I valued and I've used. But they're very often talking about dealing with emotions, for example. And, you know, I'm English and I'm male. I don't have emotions. I don't know. Emotions are what you give to horses and dogs. You know, I don't know anything about that. Part of the reason I think why teachers do this is because that's the kind of questions that they get asked. And I've noticed for a long time when I'd sit around senior teachers and I'd listen to the kind of questions they get asked. And then I see that they will give an answer. And a lot of the time, they don't know what they're talking about. Like, I'll give you an example. I heard one person who asked the teacher, when you go to sleep at night, should you have the light on or the light off? This isn't Dharma. But the problem is, if you ask the person the question, they're going to come up with an answer. So this teacher said, oh, very definitely you should have the light off. Well, had you done any research about that? Does it have any bearing on enlightenment? Did the Buddha talk about it? So the problem is, if you ask a question, they're going to come up with an answer. And I find myself doing this as well. And I'm a bit more clued up now than I used to be. Now I'm in my 50s. And I'm a bit more responsible of saying, I have no idea. If you ask me a question and I don't know, I'll say I don't know. Or you ask me a question that relies on my opinion, and I'll say, well, this is my opinion. But for example, the stuff that's going on in Ukraine right now, I have many things that we could talk about on the Ukrainian situation, but I'm not here as a Ukrainian expert. And if you ask me a question about Ukraine, I really can't answer. And I'm much more comfortable these days with admitting that I can't answer. One of my friends was a translator for the Dalai Lama. He's a Swiss guy. And he said the same things, that people would ask all kinds of questions to these senior Tibetan monks. Things like, if I have 5 cats in my house, what will happen to my rebirth? And they'll say, oh, you'll definitely be reborn as a cat, or something like that. And they don't know what they're talking about, but it's the questioner's fault, because you ask the question of something that they're not qualified to answer. By the way, the Buddha did teach something about that. He said, it's a very obscure sutta, but he said something about if you fix your attention onto animals, you have a chance of being reborn as one of those animals. So I had this, always had this disconnect between my experience, what the Buddha taught, and what people are teaching. And only slowly has it come together. And I think actually only about 1.5 years ago, suddenly all of it just slotted into place. Every part of Dharma fell into place for me. And so I'm really quite excited about it and happy about it. I'm glad to say that most of my meditation now I really enjoy, because I know what I'm doing, which I think I may not have known what I was doing before. I think with meditation, the important thing is to keep doing it. That was how it was for me. It's not something that you figure out and then you can do it. For example, if this experiment that they had was actually a Gestalt experiment with monkeys, and you can see it on YouTube. They hung bananas up on the wall in an enclosure where there was a table, a chair, and a stick. And the monkey has to drag the table over, put the chair on the table, and then stand on the chair with the stick. And then it can get the bananas. And the monkeys would flounder about and try things randomly. And at some point, they would finally get the correct formulation and get the bananas. But once they'd done it once, they knew how to do it. So every time you put them in the enclosure with the table, the chair, and the stick, they would immediately assemble it and get the bananas. In psychology, this is called insight learning. Some animals are better at it than others. Cats, I'm sad to say, they don't get it. They have no insight learning. They actually learn quite slowly. A very famous set of experiments by Thorndike was on cats escaping from a cage. So we have this insight learning, means that you figure something out and then you can do it. But repetition learning, there's technical names for it that escape me at the moment. Procedural learning are things that you learn by repeatedly doing them. So for example, a guitar, if any of you have played the guitar or any musical instrument, that you don't get taught how to do it and then you can just play the guitar. You have to continually practice and practice and practice. So that's called procedural learning. You learn how to do something. And even interestingly, people who have total amnesia, who can't remember who they are, or in one case, a famous case of a man called M, and he couldn't remember more than 30 seconds. But you could, in fact, teach him something like how to use a spanner or a mouse or click on something, and then test him on it the next day, and he would have a memory of how to use that item, even though he had no memory of actually learning it. By the way, raise your hand if anyone has a question. You're welcome to stop. So meditation is like that. It's a procedural learning thing. It's something that you have to learn by doing it, like a musical instrument or playing tennis or something like that. You have to continually keep on practicing. And that's the most important thing. However, there are right understandings and wrong understandings of meditation. And for a long time, I was taught to leave thoughts in your mind and just be aware of them. And don't attach onto them, don't reject them, let them be there. And that's not a bad teaching when you're trying to calm the mind down. But if you're trying to get to the actual states that the Buddha taught about, the thinking has to stop. And this was a slow realization for me that to really make these attainments, you have to take control of the mind. This is what the Buddha was actually teaching. When you go to the suttas, the Buddha himself is very kind of hardcore. He's not gentle or encouraging. For example, he said there are two kinds of thinking: good thinking and wrong thinking. He said, wrong thinking, as soon as you realize it's wrong thinking, you stop it. And good thinking may help you. It may be blameless, but you're never going to progress in meditation, so you have to stop it. This is called the Dveda Vitakka Sutta. And the Buddha said both kinds of thinking have to come to an end in order to get the insight. So he was very hardcore, and I kind of like, in my mind, is a very Indian thing. Indians by nature tend to be like this. They have an idea and they take it to the absolute extreme. So this is a wrong thinking, therefore I stop it. I wish it was that easy for the rest of us. I have wrong thinking and I can't stop it. It goes on and on. Somebody blames me for something or insults me and it goes around my head for weeks and months. And sometimes it pops back up from 20 years later, pops back up into my head and I can't shake it out. But nonetheless, that was the teaching, was taking control of the mind and experience. Now, you can do that in the wrong way. If you try to grasp the mind and control the mind in the wrong way, it's going to heat up and suffer. So I always used to call this the German method of meditation, because the Germans in the monastery in England, they would kind of screw their face up and you know, squint up their eyes and really meditate. I shouldn't be, this day and age, we shouldn't talk about national characteristics like that, should we? We should be inclusive. At least they were making an effort. But that kind of taking control is the wrong way to do it. If you're screwing up your face and you're really exerting a huge amount of pressure, that's not the correct way to be taking control of the mind and doing meditation. So the key insight for, by the way, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about how the mind works according to Buddhism. We'll have a look at the dependent origination diagram to remind ourselves about dependent origination. If you don't know what dependent origination is, don't worry. I'm going to be talking about the principle of it. You don't need to know all the particular terms. We're going to talk a little bit about how Gestalt talks about perception and action, most specifically action. And then we're going to look at a couple of suttas, the actual suttas of how the Buddha described this taking control of the mind. Yeah, I just noticed on the chat, you said my videos can be found at littlebang.org. It's actually in YouTube is a different title. Yeah, I put it into the chat, all one word, littlebang.org in YouTube. So I hope you actually saw the YouTube video that I put up about Gestalt and the Gestalt interpretation. But in summary, it goes like this. When we look at the actual nature of the mind, what the mind is actually doing, not what we think it's doing, what we find is that attention flits from one object to another object to another object. We have this idea that you're sitting in the room and you're joining the Zoom conference, and that's the thing that you were doing. But that's actually not what your experience is. Your experience is you look at the screen, then you look at my face, you look at someone else's face, then you scratch your foot, then you kick the cat, you grab a drink of water, you hear something outside, you come back, you scratch your nose, you think of a question, something I say reminds you of something, and your mind goes to that, and then you think about that for a few minutes, and that reminds you that you've got the cauliflower cooking in the microwave. And this is the actual nature of the experience if you look at it directly. The mind flits from one object to another object to another object. The role and the function of our ego or our psyche is to try and bind this experience together so that it feels like a continuous experience. And so we'll try to bind the experience into a story, and that story will kind of unify or organize your experience for you. So you're in here doing the Zoom call, that's your kind of binding story. That's covering up the fact that your mind is flitting from one thing to another thing to another thing. These things that your mind flits to, these we can call objects, objects of consciousness. And this was the way that the Buddha taught to analyze the mind. I should mention there are other ways to analyze the mind. If you are building a bridge, there's no point in looking at consciousness and the way your mind flits around. You have to think in terms of solid materials and stress loads and wind and foundations and everything else. So if you're building a bridge, there's a different way to think. If you're raising a child, there's a different way to think. If you're playing around on Photoshop, as I was today, that's a different way of thinking. So this particular way of looking at experience is not the only way to look at experience, but it was the way that the Buddha taught as a path to liberation. To see the mind picking up one thing at a time, flitting to another thing, flitting to another thing. And the thing that is real is what you are perceiving. This is a core element of Gestalt psychology, of phenomenology in philosophy, and also in Buddhism. The thing that is real is the thing that you are experiencing. Now that goes against the normal Western view of the world, because we like to think of the world as being objectively real and existing outside of ourselves. That's what's real. So I'll give you an easy example. If you see a piece of rope on a pathway and you think that piece of rope is a snake, but it's not a snake, it's actually a piece of rope. What is real in that situation? So a materialist, westernized viewpoint would be to say, the thing that is real is the piece of rope. There isn't a snake, it is a rope, that's reality. You may have misperceived reality. But according to Franz Brentano, who I introduced you to, I think last time, the philosopher, and according to phenomenology and Gestalt psychology, the thing that's real is the thing that's perceived. Your perception of a snake is actually real and present in your mind. the fact that it doesn't marry up exactly to the external world is beside the point. What you are experiencing is a snake. And more than that, the snake is the thing that is governing your behavior. You are going to act and react as if it's as a snake there rather than if it's a piece of rope. So this way of looking at the world would put much higher emphasis on perception as being reality rather than an objective view of the universe. The Gestalt psychologist had an example. I think this was Kohler. And he said, he gave the example of a man who is looking to go to a particular inn, and he's riding a horse and sleigh, and he sees the inn across a field. So he takes the horse and the sleigh across this open field to the inn, and he shouts out to the person, "Is anybody here?" And they come out and they say to him, "What on earth are you doing? This isn't the inn." And he said, "I've just come across the field to spend the night at the inn." And the person says to him, "What field? There isn't any field." And he points. And what had happened was he'd actually come across a frozen lake surface, which is not a good idea to do with a horse because the horse's hooves can smash through the ice very easily. So they were all in a panic and a flap because he'd mistaken the field for the lake for a field. So the lesson that he learned from this was the thing that's real, the thing that's governing your behavior is your perception. He perceived a field, that's how he acted. And fortunately, the world supported him in that and he didn't crash through the lake. So that's the thing that's real, the organizing gestalt or the organizing story that's governing his life, his perception, his suffering or his happiness is the thing that's perceived. I'll give you another example. If you think back to something that happened to you some years ago that you didn't like, my usual go-to example is somebody stole £500 off me once after I'd done a particularly good job rebuilding a car for somebody, and I got paid and then the money got stolen. Now, if I think about that, I start getting agitated. I know who took the money. Shall I go back? Shall I find him? Shall I beat him up? Should I have beaten him up at the time? Should I have called the police? And what happens is I start to suffer. And that's because I picked up that object. And only when I pick up that object, which can be a sight, a sound, a smell, a memory, anything, then I'm going to suffer over it. If I'm not thinking about that story, I can't suffer over that story. So the Buddha put it this way in one of his suttas, which was on the original Gestalt video that I put on YouTube. Imagine a cow, and the cow goes and leans against the fence, but the insects from the fence crawl onto his skin and bite and irritate him. It's a cow, right? So she moves away from the fence and she lies down in the grass, but the insects in the grass invade her skin, they bite and irritate. So she gets up and dashes over to the water and dives in the water, but the insects in the water invade and irritate her skin, and so on and so forth. And wherever the cow, whatever the cow leans against, that is going to cause the suffering for the cow. It could, doesn't say so in the sutta, but it could cause happiness too. If she goes and finds some nice food and starts eating the food, then she may be happy about that. The point is that when the mind goes to lean on something, the cow leaning on something means the mind going out to an object. When the mind picks up an object, you're going to suffer over that object, either feeling happy or unhappy because of the object, because of that thing that you're calling into mind. I find this quite profound because it has some interesting consequences if you really think it through. If, say, you had a difficult childhood, because I didn't have a particularly great childhood, but I don't think about it very much. If I think about it, I might suffer. If I think about bad things, I'll suffer. If I think about the good things in my childhood, then I'll feel happy. But if I don't think about my childhood, can it cause me suffering? This is a really interesting question, because in psychology, the answer would be yes. Freud would say, yes, it's the things that happened to you in the past that are governing your experience now and causing you to be suffering or not suffering. So I want to leave that question hanging, because the Freudian way of understanding things, which is only one of the schools of psychology, would say, in fact, you can suffer over something that you're not directly experiencing in the present moment. According to Buddhism, that's not the case. According to Buddhism, it's the object that you are leaning on, your consciousness is leaning on or holding in the mind, that you're going to feel happy or sad about while it's there in your mind. When you put your mind onto something else, that suffering goes away. Then you suffer over the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So when we see the world in this manner, as one object after another object after another object arising into consciousness, ceasing from consciousness, this is what the Buddha described as like a monkey swinging through the trees of a forest. Grabs hold of one branch, it lets go, it grabs hold of another branch, it lets go, grabs hold of another branch, in this continual movement that doesn't stop. He said, that's how your mind works. Not the agitated mind. Doesn't mean the monkey mind as in you can't control your mind right now, you got too much. This is all mind. Even when you're calm and happy, your mind is still doing this same thing, moving from one thing to another thing to another thing. And then suffering over each thing. Now remember, suffering includes the happiness or unhappiness. So even if I think about cheesy Vegemite, every time I see Meredith, I think about cheesy Vegemite. So then my mind, is that making my mind happy or not happy? Well, I like the object in my mind, but I'm suffering in the sense that it's causing an agitation in my mind, that my mind is now condensed around that particular object until I forget about it. If I hold on to it, that's what we call attachment or clinging, then I'm going to suffer because I start wanting it. Like, well, I haven't got any bread, I haven't got any, how do I get hold of some? Shall I just get some cheese and some Vegemite? Is that the same thing? And so you see, now, while I'm thinking about cheesy Vegemite, that whole story about the 500 pounds that was stolen, that's gone, right? I'm not suffering over that story anymore. Now, a psychologist would tell you that story is still in your subconscious. So it may still be affecting your life, but according to Dharma, that's not the way that we look at things. We're looking at one object to another object to another object. Because the mind ties our experience together into stories, we don't see this impermanent nature of the mind. The Buddha said that it's easy to see that this body is impermanent because 40 years, 80 years, 120 years, the body becomes old, the skin becomes leathery, the teeth fall out, the back becomes crooked as a roof rafter. I love that analogy. It's the exact words that he used. If you think about these old wooden buildings that are falling down, it's a really good analogy. He said it's easy to see that the body is impermanent, but it's hard to see that the mind is impermanent. So the talk I have on YouTube and the last time that I was here, I gave a number of examples about how when an object arises in the mind, it arises complete. It arises as a complete whole. Now I'm going to share a picture with you that I shared last time. There's something quite interesting about this. So you should be able to see this very famous image of the vase and the two faces. here the images are being exaggerated so you can see the faces on the one side and the vase on the other side. You can see this. Just give me a thumbs up. You can see that image?
You haven't shared the screen, Bhante.
I thought I did, but okay. Oh, I have to click share. There we go. Okay, so you can see the vase now? The vase and the two faces, okay. So this is a very famous image, and importantly, you will either see the vase or you'll see the faces. You really can't see both at the same time, because the mind is automatically processing all the information first and presenting it to you as a complete object. And that object that is presented to you is complete with, oh, here we go. When you look at that, this is what I showed you last time. It's impossible to look at that and not see the animal smiling. You know in your intelligence that the animal isn't smiling, right? You know that's not true. It's just happens to be a face that was caught on camera. It's not laughing. It's not amused by anything. In fact, it's probably annoyed. But we can't help it, because when the mind touches an object, it comes complete with the mental and physical factors. So here you have added into the picture that before you see it, you're already getting this mental interpretation of smiling. By the way, human beings, even babies, are preconditioned to actually see smiles and to recognize faces. And there's some people, some famous people who can't recognize faces because they don't have that neural network. So they can literally turn around and turn back and they won't know that you're the person they were talking to 30 seconds ago.
Bhante, how do you know that the donkey is not smiling? It looks very smiley to me.
Because donkeys don't do that when they're smiling. They may eat or something. I mean, somebody tickling it on the ribs or something, tickling its armpits? I mean,
so you think donkey don't smile?
That isn't a smiling donkey, no. Our mind is automatically putting that in. Now, you think about emojis, you have two dots and a little smiley face underneath it. That's all you need for the mind to add in smiling. And it adds in that mental component of understanding smiling into that emoji. And that's why emojis actually work, because they're a shortcut to those neural networks. I wanted to show you the update of the vase and the two faces. It was in the newspaper a couple of days ago. It just shows that these things are always new. So that's an update, interesting update to the vase. The vase thing is very, very old illusion, but this one just came out a couple of days ago. Do you see an apple core or do you see faces? Can you see both at the same time, the apple core and the faces? Your mind is going to try to formulate an object of one kind or another. So it will give you one or the other, faces or apple core. Of course, I saw this in the newspaper and it said, if you see an apple core, that means that you're a person who's very optimistic in the world and you have a positive outlook and you're going to meet a tall, dark, handsome stranger in the next few days. And so they put these kind of things on. Illusions, optical illusions, audio illusions, as well, haptic illusions, which is illusions of feeling. I don't know if you ever did this one with your hands. If you keep, it's hard to see on the video, but if you keep pushing your hands together like this, after a while, it feels like there's a piece of glass in between your hands. So you have to keep pumping like that. So quite quickly, it doesn't show up on the video, but I'm doing it quite quickly. It feels like there's a piece of glass on your hand. So there are haptic illusions, feeling illusions. There are audio illusions, there are visual illusions. Basically means the mind is desperately trying to form objects out of the experience in the world. I want to do an experiment with you. I've done this a number of times. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap on my cup. Let's just check that you can hear it. Give me thumbs up if you can hear it loudly. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to tap a tune that you know. Okay. Now, if you know the tune, don't say anything. Just wait till I finish, and then I'll ask you, and you'll get your chance to prove to everyone that you could understand the tune. When I do this, usually about 1 in 30 people will get the tune, will know what tune I'm tapping. Are you all ready? Most of you I can't see. Alex, Sue, Lil, Sue, Anne, or these people I can't see them.
You want to stop share so that we can see a big screen of you?
Okay. Okay. Okay, are you ready for the experiment? Okay. Put your hand up if you think you know that tune. 1. Go on, Meredith. What is it? Oh, 2. What is it?
Jingle bell.
Okay.
My thoughts too. Sing Jingle Bells.
You got Jingle Bells. It was Jingle Bells. So you two are pretty good. Usually about 1 in 30 will get it. But you listen to it again now that you know what it is. Notice how your mind is filling in that tune now. You're hearing an actual tune and a song rather than tapping. So this is the gestalt. This is the organizing story. When you have one of the translations for the word gestalt is organization, and it organizes your experience. See if you get this one.
Ante, I think you're too close to the mic, so we don't hear the second part of it.
Okay.
Can't hear the rest of it. It's just only the first 4 clangs, and then the rest of it you can't hear.
Okay. I'll try a different.
Go further, maybe.
Okay, I'm tapping out que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. But once you know that I'm doing that, if you hear me tapping it, it will organize automatically the pieces of that tune. So you're not actually hearing the tapping, you're hearing the song that you know. It's the mental aspect is being added to your experience before you experience it. And that's the nature of perception in Buddhism. No physical experience arises without the mental concomitants, and no mental concomitants arise without the physical part of the experience. So every object which your consciousness lands on has to have a physical aspect and has to have a mental aspect. So what happens then is you're going to go back to some screen sharing now. If I can find my screen sharing button. Did that share? I don't think that shared, did it? Oh, it did. So you can see this dependent origination circle, make it a bit bigger. So this is what was happening in dependent origination, the key teaching in Buddhism. If you look over on the right-hand side there, you see consciousness and name and form. And these two were said to lean on each other like two sticks of bushels leaning on each other. So consciousness, or vijnana, we should translate as cognition. It's cognizing an object. It is not consciousness as in the Western idea that consciousness is some kind of light that is dim in the morning, is bright after you have your coffee, gets dull when you get to work, gets brighter on a Friday night when you're going out clubbing. And that's our view of consciousness, and it goes, the light goes out when you're asleep. That is not consciousness here. Consciousness here is cognition of an object. So you see on the right-hand side there, consciousness or cognizing. And the next one is called name and form, which is the object. Name means the mental aspect and form is the physical aspect. So when we saw the donkey, we can have the physical sight of the picture of the donkey, but we also have the mental aspect, is we know what the donkey is doing or how it's feeling, or we think we do. So the cognition and the thing that are cognized go together. They lean on each other and depend on each other. You can't have cognizing without an object to cognize, and no object can arise without the cognition of it. So, my coffee cup now, which I was tapping, I can't see it now. So it's not arising as an object in my consciousness. So cognizing and the thing cognized arise together and cease together. That's why in Buddhism, consciousness is something that continually arises and ceases, arises and ceases, arises and ceases. And that's the way that we taught to look at the world for Dhamma purposes. If we follow around from the circle, consciousness and name and form then is cognizing an object. Because of cognizing an object, we activate one of the senses. We have the sense that we are in contact with that object. We have the feeling of liking or disliking that object. We have the craving of whether we want to get that object or get rid of that object. We have clinging to the object or our ideas about the object. And because of clinging, we have bhava, which means action. So you take an action. The words of the sutta is you become engaged with that object. So I say to you now, something like Ukraine, the word, the physical vibrations of the air, that's the sense impression, the name and form. You're cognizing the word. That's causing the activation from the sound sense. You have the feeling of contacting the subject of Ukraine, you liking it or disliking it. You have craving, whether you want to get it or get rid of it. You have attachment to it. And then your mind has launched into bhava or becoming, which is when you've become consciously engaged with that object. And you'll start thinking about it and considering it and what you want to do with it, what you should do. Should you donate some money or some, write a letter of complaint to Vladimir Putin or something like that. And that's how this cycle of dependent origination works. As soon as a different object comes in to cognition, then that Ukraine story will disappear. And so you hear a sound outside your window. You say, well, is that my neighbor shouting at me? And your mind goes out to that, and then you're activated the idea of your neighbor. You're in contact with that object. You like it, you dislike it, you're craving, you're not craving, you're clinging, you're attached, and so on. And so the mind gets launched into story after story after story, and that's dependent origination. I should say there are some different interpretations of this teaching, but this is my session, so I get to give my interpretation of this teaching. And it's not that complicated when you view it in this way. Now, so we get that from consciousness and name and form, but you see that before consciousness is this word formations, sankhara. So it's on the upper right hand side of the circle. Formations or sankhara. Sankhara are also translated as volitional intentions, determinations. There's a whole bunch of different words that are used to translate this term. And I have to be honest that there is a lot of discussion and a lot of argument about what this word sankhara actually means. One of the meanings of sankhara that is the one that I tend to use in this circumstance is an action of body, speech, or mind. In Buddhist philosophy, there are three actions: body, speech, and mind. Usually in Western philosophy, we have two kinds of actions of the body or actions of the mind. Buddhism categorizes it differently and has three: body, speech, and mind. It's just a different way of categorizing things. And that is when you are forming an action, when you're doing something, that will start to organize your consciousness. That will start to organize which objects are going to come up into your consciousness. So one of the examples the original Gestalt psychologist gave was, if you imagine some children playing a game of tag, and they're running around and playing tag. You know tag, right? Where you touch somebody and then they're it, and then whoever is it has to tag other people, and there's different rules to it. Now, if you were to try and analyze that, the actions of the children in terms of ego psychology, you would get very quickly become very difficult to understand what's going on. Ego psychology would say, well, the child has an innate tendency to want to, children have three games that they play: chasing, hunting, or rearing. So you're either fighting something, you're chasing something, or you're rearing something. So you may notice that young boys, they love to play with guns. They have an instinctive desire to play with guns. And some parents find this very worrying, but in fact, that's just the natural thing that animals do. We want to fight, we want to hunt, and we want to rear. And all games are derived from those three actions. These kittens in my corridor, where they were the same, I was sat out like cuddling the kittens. I went out for a cuddle because I want to play a rearing game. So cuddling something is rearing. And I took my drink out with me, but the cats just wanted to jump on the straw that I was using. I think I have it. You probably can't see it because you've shared the picture. So they wanted to play with the straw, you see, they wanted to fight, on the hunt and fight. So if you try and analyze children playing a game of tag by ego psychology, you will have great difficulty, because you have to say, well, the child has an instinct to hunt. This instinct to hunt is blah, blah, blah. And then it has happy feelings or unhappy feelings, depending on whether it's successful or not. And then some children will feel worse because they couldn't run away, or they don't run as fast. And the whole thing becomes very difficult to understand a game of tag if you're trying to analyze each particular child and their ego consciousness. But a game of tag is very easy to understand if you just know the rules of the game of tag. The rules of the game of tag, that organizes your experience for you. And all of the children are following these very simple rules of the game of tag. So one of the examples in the Gestalt psychology is of a dog chasing a rabbit. When the dog is chasing the rabbit, everything that comes into the dog's perception is automatically organized in the context of chasing the rabbit. Everything is an object to either be jumped over, run through, or run around. basically 3 options. And all of the dog's experience are organized by that action that the dog is taking. So this is quite important, because when I talk about Buddhism as one object after another object after another object, that sounds very passive. It sounds like that, you know, the way you experience it in meditation is something that's happening to you that you don't really have much control over. And the reason it doesn't feel like that is because we have this agency. And agency means that you have a controlling input into what objects are coming into your experience and how you are organizing them in your mind. So the dog chasing the rabbit, that is its organizing experience. And for you too, I want to give the example of the way that we build up a Gestalt action in the same way as we build up a Gestalt object. So I gave the example last week of the shopping cart here. It's supposed to be a chariot, but I've updated it to be a modern world. What is the shopping cart? Well, there's wheels, there's a certain amount of strength, there's a carrying capacity, there's a handle to maneuver it. These are all part and parcel. These are parts that we build up into a single whole, right? We don't see lots of little parts and then figure out that this is a shopping cart. We see the shopping cart first. That's already organized by your mind before it's presented to consciousness. In the same way as the shopping cart is made up of parts, actions that we take can be built up of smaller actions. So I want to give the example of learning to drive. Hopefully you've all learned to drive at some point. If you remember back to when you're learning, you've got your left foot on the clutch, your left hand on the gear stick, you've got your right foot on the accelerator pedal and the brake. That's confusing enough. And you've got to look behind you, you've got to check your mirror, you've got to check your gear, you've got to check which way your steering is, and it gets really complicated, right? And you just like fumble and the car jolts and you can't do it. There's just too many things to remember. And your teacher's saying, no, you didn't look in the mirror. You'll fail your exam if you don't look in the mirror. And then you have to look over your shoulder as well. And I distinctly remember learning to drive. And there's just so many things that you have to think of and learn. It's difficult. But what happens is, just like the shopping cart is assembled from the pieces, actions are assembled from smaller actions. So now when you get in your car that you're familiar with, you just have the one action in your mind, drive to the shop, right? Everything else gets organized for you. Your hand moves, your foot moves, your indicator goes on, you check your mirror, you turn the steering wheel. All happens automatically, but you only have the one intention, drive to the shop. You're not aware of each individual motion. So this is how actions are also gestalts, just like gestalt objects that we have gestalt actions. I actually had a really weird experience with this years ago when I was living in the monastery for the first time. And my job was to make breakfast. We rotated the jobs around. And I was really practicing my meditation hard and trying to be mindful the whole time. And when I went down to make breakfast, my mind suddenly went very still. While my mind was still, my hands were making breakfast. And I had this experience of looking down and watching my hands doing stuff. I was like, whoa, that's really freaky. That's weird. And then my whole body would spin around and I'd turn on the water for the tea. And then I'd see my hand reaching up to the cupboard and grabbing the tea out of the cupboard. And then I'd suddenly turn around and I'd see my hand grab the spoon and it would stir the porridge pot because we had porridge every day for breakfast. Very weird indeed to stop sharing for a moment. Very strange indeed to see that actually I don't need to be participating in what I'm doing, that it's doing it automatically. I had the same thing when I was driving. It was actually my first time with this experience. And I saw my hands moving the steering wheel, flicking on the indicator, turning the indicator off. I felt my feet changing from the accelerator to the brake. I'd never experienced that before. I just drive somewhere. I just think I'm going home for lunch, which is what I was doing on that day. So this is how we get the sense of agency, and this is why we don't experience things as one action, one object, another object, another object, another object, because it's all organized by a sense of agency first. And this is what sankhara are. The sankhara is taking an action of the body, speech, or the mind. When you take that action, that organizes which objects are going to come up into your experience. A really easy way to test this is to look around the table that's in front of you, for example, and look for red objects, right? And then suddenly red objects are going to jump out at you at your experience, right? Or as I was doing last week, I was looking around my table and I was looking for cat toys, anything I could play with the cats with. And that's when I came up with the straw. There it is. I have to remember not to drink from the straw because this was the cat toy. So if I say cat toys, that's my organizing action. That's my agency. And that organizes my experience and what objects are going to come up into my consciousness. Freud, by the way, wrote a whole book about this. He found it interesting that you can look for something and not find it when the thing actually is right there on the table in front of you. He wrote a whole book about this. There you go. That doubles as a red object and as a toy. There's a cat toy. Okay, so to start wrapping up to a close, because I never have a clock in front of me here, so I never know how far through we are with time.
The clock is in your computer, Bhante.
Yeah, I have a clock actually. We're 5:30 here, so okay. So the Buddha was talking about this process, and here's just one of the many suttas that he would give about this. And I'm going to give you two suttas today. I'm going to read from the sutta. When you dwell contemplating the gratification in things that can be clung to, craving increases. With craving as condition, clinging comes to be. Let me go back to dependent origination and go back to sharing my screen. Click share. Okay. Bear in mind that this process of dependent origination, very often there are only 10 links. Sometimes there's 24 links. Sometimes there were 9. Sometimes the links can switch position. So it was a very fluid teaching. If you dwell contemplating the gratification into objects that you can attach to, craving will increase. Because of craving, clinging comes to be. Because of clinging, becoming comes to be, or conscious engagement. And because of becoming, birth, aging, death, and suffering come to be. Suppose there was a great tree and all its roots going downwards would send the sap upwards. Sustained by that sap, nourished by it, the great tree would stand for a very long time. So too, if you live contemplating the gratification in objects that you can cling to, craving increases, clinging increases, becoming increases, and so arises the whole mass of suffering. So, bhikkhus, you should dwell contemplating the danger in things that can be clung to. When you do that, the craving ceases. With a cessation of craving, clinging ceases. With a cessation of clinging, conscious engagement ceases. And then birth, aging, death, and suffering will all cease. Suppose there was a great tree and a man would come along and bring a shovel and a basket, and he would cut down the tree at its foot, dig it up and pull out the roots. Even the fine rootlets and the root fiber, he would cut the tree into pieces. Then he would burn the pieces in a fire, collect the ashes and scatter them. Thus that great tree would be cut off at the root, made like a palm stump, obliterated, so it's no more subject to future arising. So too monks dwell contemplating the danger in things that can be clung to. So this is quite typical of this kind of sutta. Notice the language that the Buddha uses. That tree would be obliterated, so it cannot arise in the future. This isn't the very soft language that many people have of be compassionate and be calm and let things go. No, the Buddha was obliterate it, wipe it out, rip it up by its entire roots, burn it and scatter the ashes. I like this kind of hardcore Indian Buddha. So in this sutta, the Buddha's making it clear that your mind can attach to objects of cognition. If you sit thinking about the gratification of those objects, craving increases. So if I think about cheesy Vegemite, or if I think about a pizza, or if I think about $1 million, my craving for that thing will increase. Because of my craving increases, my attachment increases, I'm consciously engaged with that object. And because of my nature to be consciously engaged in things all the time, this is what perpetuates the rebirth of consciousness over and over again. He says, dwell contemplating the danger in attaching to any kind of object. If we do that, then the craving will cease, the clinging will cease, the conscious engagement with objects will cease, and the whole mass of suffering will come to a complete and utter end. So this is how the Buddha would talk about this process. He's pointing to a state of mind, a state of being that arises when your mind isn't going out to any object at all. This is the crucial point. This is what we should be doing in meditation. This is what we should be aiming towards as the goal of meditation. A point of come back. A point of equipoise, where the mind isn't picking up any object, it isn't cognizing things. Now, the important thing here, that the thing that I was never taught when I was young, and well, I'm still young, but when I was a junior monk, the thing that I was never taught was when the mind isn't cognizing objects, that's not dead. It's not brain dead. We call the dial tone from God, like God has hung up and we just have a blank dial tone. When the mind stops engaging with objects, it becomes brighter, sharper, clearer, and more aware. And you have this sense, this very clear sense of continuous presence. And that's the experience that we should be aiming towards. And this is what I was talking about in the last couple of weeks. Holding the mind in that equipoise, not allowing it to fall into cognizing this object, this object, this object, this object. Now, when we do that, when we're holding the mind in this equipoise, what can happen is the mind's still going out to objects, because that's the nature of the mind, that's the way that you've trained it. It's always going to be looking out for objects. That's why meditation is difficult. That's why the Buddha called this a training. Let me tell you, let me read a bit more of the sutta. To put the light on. Suppose there was an oil lamp that was burning in dependence upon an oil and a wick, and the man did not pour oil onto it or adjust the wick. Then, formally, when the supply of fuel is exhausted, that lamp, not being fed with any more fuel, lacking sustenance, would be extinguished. So too, one lives contemplating the danger in things that can be attached to. Then craving ceases, conscious engagement ceases, this whole process of becoming ceases. So what happens if you hold your mind in this equipoise, not allowing the mind to go out to any object, the fuel burns down. And this continual reaching out of the mind, going outside of itself, starts to extinguish. The process starts to come to a halt. The important thing here is you don't make the process come to a halt, because that's another action, right? If you want to try and stop the mind, that trying is another action. That's another sankhara that's governing all your experience. So you can only hold the mind in equipoise and allow it to burn itself out. And by holding into that limbo space, I call it a limbo space, bit by bit, you get these glimpses of the mind itself independent of objects. This becomes really clear. You get what we call the insight of what is the path and what is not the path. And it becomes very clear. The thing that isn't the path is the mind going out to objects, cognizing something, liking it, disliking it, getting caught up in a story about it, and being consciously engaged. When the mind lets go of all of this, it's bright, it's clear, it's present, it's sharp, it's awake, and you know clearly for yourself that this is the path that is independent of all other paths. Every other experience or every other teaching that I've ever found around the world, anywhere, depends upon having a certain object, a certain feeling that governs it. Taking drugs, being, watching your favorite, what happened the other day, there's a young Thai girl called Stamp Fairtex. She's a 24-year-old. I'm a big fan of the mixed martial arts. And she went and had the big competition in Singapore, and she got beaten up by the girl from Hawaii. And I actually shed a tear or two. I was really upset. But that's getting caught up in a story, in engaged in an object, right? When I hold my mind separate to all of these things, what happens is it coalesces, it becomes bright, stable, and clear. Last sutta then, last little bit before I open up for questions or comments, is another sutta. And in this sutta, the Buddha also lists 3 kinds of sankhara. I'll reshare the screen again just to remind you where sankhara are. So up here on the upper right hand side, formations. Formations is a bad translation. The old Pali Text Society, they used to translate it as activities, which I think was really the best translation. So the sankhara is the action that you launch into that will start to organize which objects come into consciousness. The Buddha said in another sutta, he said, there are 3 kinds of sankhara. Now, if you remember before, I said there's a sankhara can be action of body, speech, or mind, 3 kinds. In this sutta, he also gives 3 kinds of sankhara, but is a different formula. There are 3 forms of sankhara or action. An action that is meritorious, that will have a result in merit. There is an action that is non-meritorious, and that will have its result in demerit. And there is an action that is stationary, that will have a result in stillness. But if you understand the method, you do not plan any kind of act. Not planning, not acting, not willing, he grasps at nothing, and the mind becomes unperturbed. So this is very crucial. When we talk about meritorious action, the word merit, punya, actually means to brighten. So there are actions that brighten the heart and the mind, and that's the word merit. Merit isn't a very good translation because it sounds a bit like when you were at kindergarten and you got a merit badge for participating in making a caterpillar out of egg cartons or something. But it means to brighten. So some of your actions will brighten your consciousness. Some of your actions, demerit, will darken your consciousness. But another action that you can make is stationary, and that means concentration. If you concentrate the mind onto an object, for example, the breathing or metta or any other object, concentrating the mind onto an object is still another action. The result of that action will be stillness of the mind. But you'll notice the mind is still cognizing an object, right? You're still caught in this dependent origination loop because your consciousness is bound up with that object of meditation. And this is why in Buddhism, concentrating on a meditation object will not get you to enlightenment. Even though the Buddha recommended concentrating on a meditation object for various reasons. If that object is metta, it will have a good effect. Sometimes you need to concentrate on the breathing just as a way to get hold of your mind. The stillness that comes from concentration can also be used in the right way. But here he's making it quite clear that even concentrating the mind on an object in samadhi, in concentration, that also is another action of the mind that only has its result in stillness. And stillness isn't enlightenment. He says, if you know the vichar, and notice at the top of the dependent origination, the first clause, ignorance, avicca. Vichar means the method. So he said, if you know the method, you do not plan any kind of act. Not planning, not willing, you grasp at nothing, and the mind becomes unperturbed, unshakable. That's how we get to enlightenment. So I hope that my intention today, because the last two talks on this topic, I've been talking exclusively about the mind picking up objects of consciousness. Now I want to show how your agency or what you do, your intended actions, from making breakfast to driving a car, will shape the objects that your consciousness will form. So action comes first, perception comes dependent on the action that you are taking. And then just lightly, we've touched on the topic of vichar, which I'll go into more detail on another date. But we touched briefly on it. Okay. This stuff is the stuff that I've been working with personally in my own practice. And so I've been quite excited to try and share it with you. I'm never sure how much these things come across. You know, when you know something yourself and you try and explain it, but you forget that people might not know the terms or the ideas. And so, you know, do let me know or give some feedback.
Bhante, there's a question, say from John. So Bhante, can you explain further with an example of what is becoming and what is the birth, life, thought, or ego?
Okay, this is in the chat, I presume.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can, again, what is becoming and what is the birth, life, thought, or ego? I did actually want to talk about thoughts today, but didn't really get onto it. So as you see, going around the dependent origination, which you can see right in front of you, yeah. Okay, so starting from ignorance and formations, which should mean action, consciousness, which should read cognition, name of form, which is the object cognized, comes around to this thing becoming. Now, becoming, bhava, is a difficult term. It's translated in different ways. The usual translation of it is the mind going into a womb before rebirth, but it makes no sense, really. I mean, for this circle to happen, you have to be born already. You have to be awake and experiencing things. Now, bhava is also the word bhavana, which you may know is development. So when we do meditation practice, this in Buddhism is called bhavana, or development. Bhava means to make an action. Now, it's an action that you become consciously engaged in. So if I say I'm going to make breakfast, my consciousness organizes the objects. I see the objects and I get caught up into that conscious engagement. The Buddha described, he said, when you get caught up in an action like that, consciousness becomes stationed at bhava. So we go from the right-hand side, consciousness, round clockwise to the left-hand side, bhava. So becoming or being is this translation of the word bhava. And I would translate it as conscious engagement, because it's an action that you are doing. In typical Buddhist, or certainly Thai Buddhism, they'll say there are three kinds of bhava. Bhava in the sense sphere, bhava in the form sphere, and bhava in the formless sphere. Sense sphere means the heavens and hells. So any kind of action that you make will be grounded in heavens and hells. So you can do a good action or a bad action, and that will lead you up or it will lead you down. Obviously, you accumulate actions over a lifetime. It's not one action will lead you to a rebirth. The form realm means that if you engage in strong concentration meditation, that will lead you to a rebirth in the above the heavenly realms, in what's called the form realms. And if you engage in really deep concentration meditation, that will lead you into the formless realms. And that's what all Thai masters will tell you bhava means. And they're right. I mean, that's true. Every time you become consciously engaged in an action, that action will be leading you towards some kind of future. So if you like going out feeding the cats, there's a lot of cats by the temple, people go out and feed them. You know, this is a positive thing that you are doing and will tend to lead you upwards in a rebirth. I hope there's cats in heaven. I don't think I really want to go to heaven if there aren't any cats. And the same, if I engage in really deep meditation, that will tend to lead me up to higher realms. So the categorization isn't wrong. Any conscious engagement that you do, which we call becoming or being, will be grounded in these levels of the universe. However, it's, you know, it's a strange way to categorize it. Really, bhava here just means kama bhava, which means the action that you are doing, that you are caught up in and engaged in. So that's what becoming is, over on the left-hand side, bhava. Thought is interesting because thought, there are two kinds of thought. Again, various ways to categorize it, but there is directed thought and non-directed thought, sasankarikang and asasankarikang. And directed thought is where you have a story. It's not well explained in the sutras, so this is my interpretation. So, for example, you think about Ukraine right now, that's a story, you're engaged in it, you have thoughts and feelings about it, you have a history with it, you have some intentions around it, and you're consciously knowing that story and thinking it. Non-directed thought is where the mind just bobs around, and you may have experienced this in meditation. And the mind goes to, oh, what will I have for dinner tomorrow? Have I got cauliflower? How shall I do the cauliflower? Oh, I have to fix the microwave. Oh, if I fix the microwave, I need to talk to John. Where is John? I think I saw him. No, I saw his daughter yesterday. Ba, 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 ba. And the mind just bobs around aimlessly without any direction. And I think that when I look around the bus and I see most people, I think that they're in that kind of thinking. The mind just bobbing around from, it's not directed, but it can't stop thinking, so it keeps going. So that's what thought is. Thought is directed or non-directed story organization. Ego is a different one, because ego is a Freudian concept that has no place in Buddhism at all. And you'll get very confused between Buddhist concepts and Freudian concepts. Freud had his own way to organize the universe. You had an id, the ego, and the superego. The ego cannot be separated from the id and the superego. You have to understand the system as a whole. One of my favorite systems, I'd be very glad to talk to you for a very long time about ego and how it relates to Dharma, but the Buddha didn't have any kind of ego in his teaching. The concept wasn't there. So we really don't want to try and put ego into the concept of Buddhism.
So John, you have any questions that you want to ask Bhante further?
No, thank you very much, Bhante.
There's a question here, how not to think a thought.
Well, it's when you talk about just now, like when you have this very strong vibration thought about, you know, somebody owe you money, or the negative or even the positive, like when it's very strong, and you say like, how do you like stop that? When you stop that means is like you put in the effort, like it's a force things to stop the thought. The more you're trying to stop the thought, the more you will cling into that thought, isn't it?
Yeah. So the Buddha did give a sutta about this called the 5 ways to control distracting thoughts. I'll see if I can remember them. I've added a 6th one, by the way. The Buddha had 5, but I've got 6. So if I remember rightly, one way is to not think about that thought, but to think about something else. In the same way that a carpenter, when they bind pieces of wood together, they would drill a hole and put a peg into the hole to bind the 2 pieces of wood together. To get the peg out of the hole, they use a smaller peg to knock the peg out of the hole. Now, this would have made sense to people in the Buddha's time. If you've ever changed the gear link on a British Leyland A-series engine, you would also know the same thing. It has a pin in the gear link, and the only way to get the pin out is to get the exact right size little dowel, little piece of metal, and then knock it out. And if you don't have the exact right size piece of metal, you'll never get that pin out. So in the same way, you knock the one thought out by using a different thought. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to slow the thinking down, like a person who's running would say, what if I walk? And a person walking would say, what if I stand? And a person standing would say, what if I sit? In the same way, you slow the thinking down until the thinking comes to a stop. Another way was to think about the demerit of that kind of thinking. So contemplate, if I think this thought, where is it leading me? Is this helping me? Where is it leading me? How is it helping me? And to see the demerit in it. And the example was, imagine a young man or woman fond of their appearance, and if you were to drape a dead dog around that person's shoulders. I tell you, the Buddha was really hardcore. He was really hard with his analogies. That young man or woman fond of their appearance would immediately try to throw the dead dog off their shoulders. He said, in the exact same way, if you look at the demerit of that form of thinking, you will naturally want to give up that form of thinking. There was another method, which I can't remember right now, and that makes 5. But I had as a 6th one, that if none of, the 5th method was, if none of those work, you press the tongue against the roof of the mouth, you concentrate the features of the face, and you determine not to think that thought. So again, the Buddha is really hardcore in his way of doing this thing. But he's being very clear, you do have to control this. You have to take control. Anyway, the 6th method that I've added, if none of the 5 work, the 6th thing, just go to bed.
In other way is to distract yourself, kind of like distract yourself, divert yourself from that thought to, to
So you knock out
non-thoughts.
the one thought with another thought. If you have an angry thought, then try to replace it with a
Pleasant
sort of
one.
metta or something.
Yeah.
But notice here that the Buddha is very clearly saying you have to take control. And this is something that I feel is lost with a lot of teachers. They're talking about giving up control, letting go, allowing everything to be there. That has its value for a while, but there comes to a point you won't progress in meditation if you do that. And I was doing that for year after year after year. And I got very good at just being able to sit there with my mind drifting around, bobbing about, feeling quite peaceful and thinking, yeah, this is meditation. It's a long time before I realized that isn't meditation. It's just a preliminary.
Right. And Lawrence was asking, thanks, Bhante, for the talk. You mentioned that meditation on an object would not lead to enlightenment and alluded to a practice that transcends dependent origination. Could you briefly outline yours on this practice?
Just getting my coffee. Yeah, so this is what I was alluding to in the final sutta that I mentioned, the 3 kinds of action: meritorious, non-meritorious, and stationary. So meritorious is any kind of good action, from feeding the cat to doing meditation, whatever brightens the mind. Demeritorious, wanting to kill your neighbor. My friend, he has outside the row of houses where he lives, there's car parking spaces, but they're on the road. They're not driveways. But the one guy down on his block seems to feel that the space in front of that house belongs to him. And my friend parks his car there, and the guy came out and scratched it with a key, leave really nasty notes that you can't park here, it's in front of my house. It's just a street. You can't say who can park here and not. So he has a lot of demeritorious thinking will arise because of his neighbor. The 3rd form is stillness or stationary. So meditating on an object, you can attain to stillness of concentration. But that also is not enlightenment. Enlightenment is where you stop making objects in the mind. The mind stops this process of object cognition. And you can only do that by not letting the mind go onto any object or anything. So last time I gave this example of the 6 senses, that if a thought arises in the mind, you don't attach to it. You let that thought go and you return the mind to equipoise. If your mind goes out to a sound, you don't get caught up in the sound, you return the mind to equipoise. And by continually not allowing the mind to engage with any object, bit by bit, the mind starts to become self-aware. And that's the practice that we're doing. So in the sutta that I gave you, there's an act that is meritorious with its goal, with its result in merit, an act that is non-meritorious with its result in demerit. There's an act that is stationary with the result of stillness. But if you know the method, vichar, the number 1 link of dependent origination, you do not plan any kind of act. No action, no planning, no willing, grasping at nothing. The mind becomes unshakable. And that's the practice that leads to enlightenment. Yeah.
Thank you, Bhante.
Is that
oh,
like objectless samadhi? Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's objectless samadhi. The actual term samadhi is a little bit confused and it's not very clear, but that's what it is. Yeah. You have to concentrate the mind, but you're not concentrating the mind on anything. But just note that that doesn't mean the mind shuts down and goes blank. What happens is the mind becomes brighter, clearer, still, vivid, present. A couple of other experiences, you may experience the body as being very large or very small. You may experience the body as being very bright. You may experience part of the body becoming very large or very bright. All of those experiences actually are the right experiences. You keep going in, you keep centralizing your attention. Yeah.
right. Bhante, maybe next time you should allocate longer for questions. Like you just give the talk for 1 hour and at least give us half an hour for questions. There's so many questions coming in. So Anne was asking, Bhante, you just mentioned that Buddha said, admonish us to take control of our thoughts. Can you please share some suttas with us, not the letting go ones?
The Veda Vittaka Sutta. The Veda Vittaka Sutta. I think I've spelled it correctly. So that's one where the Buddha says there is good thinking, good intention. It's actually sankappa, this noble eightfold path element. And there's bad thinking, but you should stop both kinds. That's an example of it. In fact, virtually every sutta you ever come across does this, is pointing to this state of mind that is a limbo, a non-moving of the mind. It's not just trying to put a wholesome object of attention. You have to give up this process of the mind going out, attending to objects. Then the meditation really starts to come together. It makes you strong as well, because you have a foundation, a place to put your mind that can't be touched. And so it gives you a lot of confidence and, makes your mind very strong.
Bhante, do you think that you can do like a Zoom meditation retreat on Zoom, maybe on a Sunday or something, or Saturday? So you can give us more practical tips, like how do we practice this, meditation?
I'll give you one tip. If you can stop the mind from forming objects, as I say, I would say the mind becomes self-referential. This is not a term that the Buddha used, but he did talk about citta without aramana. Aramana is an object. So the citta always has an aramana. In dependent origination, consciousness always has a name and form object. Citta always has aramana, an object, but he did talk about citta without an object. So the mind without any objects in it. So he pointed to that. But this is very definitely an experience that you can have and feel and know and touch, and it becomes quite clear. Another thing that will happen, you might find that the skin becomes very oily on the face. It's less so as you get old, but you get like an oil come out on the skin, and people, if they see you and you've been doing this, will say to you, your face looks really bright. What have you been doing? And it's a result of the meditation. And it's actually in the suttas as well. The Buddha sees Sariputta. He said, your face is very bright today. What have you been doing? And Sariputta says, I've been dwelling in emptiness. And the Buddha said, dwelling in emptiness is the abiding of a great man. So that's another one of the things that you experience.
We never get enough of your teaching, Bhante. Unfortunately, it's time. It's 9:15 here in Sydney, so probably way past a lot of people's bedtime. So we will have to stop here tonight. As much as we have still a lot of questions to ask, maybe we will invite Bhante back again to continue his talk. But next time, Bhante, give us longer time for questions. Right?
Okay. You have to, because I don't have a clock here. I guess I could put a clock up, but if you like signal, then I can, you know, I really want to be good with my timing. I want a reputation as somebody who's good with the timing.
Right. Okay, next time we just time it like at least half an hour Q&A, right? So, well, thank you everybody for coming on tonight, and I hope you enjoy Bhante's talk. And again, if you wish to offer any dana, please, you know, either contact us directly, or you can just make a donation and indicate that this dana for the teacher. So also, we just want to also thank Bhante Pandit for spending this time, and the teaching to us is always very insightful, very informative, and we really learn a lot from your talk. And Bhante's talk will be, you know, when I have time. So probably after this, we can produce, make this recording into a video. So if you want to refresh, want to watch again, it will be on our website, right? So again, thank you very much, everyone. You're welcome to stay on to chat with Bhante. Otherwise, you can just leave. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.